So what happens when a brand new nation, fresh out of a revolution, suddenly just explodes in size? That right there is the story of the early American Republic. We're going to dig into that really intense period between 1754 and 1800. It's a time that was defined by this relentless push westward, by fierce conflict, and, tragically, by the massive expansion of slavery.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the massive westward push of the population. Then we'll get into the conflict that, was bound to erupt on the frontier. And finally, we'll see how the institution of slavery started to harden, really dividing the nation from the inside out.
All right, let's start with just the raw energy of this young country. The United States was going through this incredible population boom, and it was fueling a constant, non-stop drive outward into new lands.
I mean, just look at these numbers. They are staggering. The population rocketed from about 2.5 million to nearly 5 million people in just a little over 2 decades. And when you have that kind of explosive growth, plus this really powerful desire to own land, well, that creates an immense, almost unstoppable pressure to expand west.
But that, of course, raises a critical question, right? Because that land wasn't empty. This massive migration was putting all these new settlers on a direct collision course with the American Indian groups who had called those lands home for generations.
So let's actually go to that frontier and see how this all played out. It's so important to understand this wasn't some empty wilderness. It was a deeply contested homeland where all these different groups were fighting for control, for resources, and really for their very way of life.
And you have to understand, the indigenous peoples were absolutely not just passive bystanders in all this. They responded with really sophisticated and adaptive strategies. They were constantly forming and reforming alliances with European powers, with other tribes, and even with the U.S. itself, all with one consistent goal: to try and limit that settler migration and protect their lands.
This timeline really helps you see the arc of this conflict. You can see how it starts with these widespread unified uprisings like Pontiac's rebellion against British policies, and it just builds and builds towards these decisive military showdowns like the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which would completely reshape the entire region.
The Battle of Fallen Timbers. Wow, this was such a devastating turning point. The Western Confederacy of Tribes suffered a major military defeat. But what made it even worse was that their supposed British allies, who were afraid of starting a war with the U.S., literally shut the gates on them and refused them shelter. The U.S. Army used these brutal, scorched earth tactics, burning villages, burning crops, and ultimately forced the tribes to give up huge territories in Ohio.
Now here's the thing. Officially, the new U.S. government had a clear policy on all this. The Constitution itself, through what's called the Commerce Clause, explicitly recognized that any tribes signing treaties were sovereign, independent nations. That was the law of the land, at least on paper.
But, and this is a huge but, this is where you see this deep, deep contradiction between policy and practice. On one hand, the federal government said it had the sole authority to deal with these sovereign tribes. But in reality, in nearly every single conflict between settlers and Native Americans, the government sided with the settlers. It just failed to enforce its own treaties over and over again. And this whole westward push was also creating these new kind of uniquely American identities. Take the squatter, for instance. These were often poor migrants who would just go and settle on land without any legal title. And they embodied this real contradiction in the American identity. On one hand, they were praised as these rugged, self-reliant individualists. But on the other, the elites looked down on them as crude, violent white savages. It's like an early version of that anti-government, fiercely independent spirit that's still such a powerful force in America.
And that tension on the frontier, well, it could just explode into this raw, racialized violence. You had groups like the Paxton Boys, who were essentially white supremacist vigilante militias. They carried out these horrific massacres of innocent American Indians. And it just shows you the deep-seated hatred that was simmering right below the surface.
Okay, let's shift our focus a bit, because this relentless push for new land on the frontier wasn't just about expansion. It was forcing a crisis within the nation itself. See, every time a new territory was acquired, it raised this explosive question. Would it be free or would it be slave? It tied the fate of the West directly to the institution of slavery.
And right from the very beginning, there were people calling for an end to it. Religious groups like the Quakers were some of the first. And in 1790, an abolitionist society led by none other than Benjamin Franklin petitioned the new Congress. They were basically pleading, let's deal with this now, before it gets even more deeply rooted in our country.
And this was just a massive missed opportunity. Congress debated it. But in the end, they decided the Constitution prevented them from even touching the issue until at least 1808. They essentially just kicked the can down the road, and that allowed the institution of slavery to grow stronger and stronger for decades to come.
But resistance didn't just come from petitions. It came from the enslaved people themselves. Gabriel's Rebellion is a hugely significant, though tragic, example. It was planned by an enslaved blacksmith named Gabriel, and the whole plot was inspired by the ideals of the American and the Haitian revolutions. The goal was to march on Richmond and demand freedom. And his vision was remarkable. It even included an alliance with poor white workers. The plan was ultimately undone by a bad storm and by betrayal, which led to just brutal reprisals.
So even with this resistance, slavery wasn't just surviving, it was expanding and fast. And the single greatest trigger for that expansion wasn't a law, it wasn't a war, it was a simple technological invention.
This sequence here shows the devastating chain reaction that was sparked by Eli Whitney's cotton gin. See, before the gin, cleaning cotton was this slow, painstaking work. The machine made it exponentially faster. And suddenly, growing cotton became incredibly profitable. That profit motive created this insatiable demand for more land in the South and, tragically, for more enslaved labor to work that land.
This explosion in demand led to what historians now call the Second Middle Passage. And it was just horrific. This was a massive internal slave trade where hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were forcibly sold from the Upper South, states like Virginia and Maryland, down to the booming cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South. It tore countless families apart in the process.
And in a final, terrible rush before that legal door closed, the importation of enslaved people directly from Africa just surged. In the 20 years before the international slave trade was finally banned in 1808, nearly 200,000 enslaved Africans were brought to the U.S. To put that in perspective, that's about half as many as had been brought over in the previous 180 years.
So when you pull all of this together, you see a founding period that we often like to idealize, but in reality, it was just shot through with intense conflict. Conflict over land, conflict over identity, and conflict over basic human rights. The foundations being laid weren't just for a new nation, they were for its deepest and most enduring struggles. And that really leaves us with a final, crucial question to think about. As we grapple today with our own debates over land rights, racial justice, and economic inequality, how are we still living with the unresolved conflicts that were born in this founding era?